Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is Wednesday, August 28th, 2019. Now, if you're like me, you've probably seen a ton of posts, articles, videos, blogs, whatever it may be, making the case that one government program or another doesn't work, or one government proposal or another doesn't work, can't work, has failed to work, has cost too much. Whatever the case, but just basically the goal that the majority of the people promoting it want to have happen isn't going to happen or has failed to happen. And this is what's called a utilitarian argument, because the case that they're making is based on the utility of the so-called program or law or whatever. And when the utilitarian argument is just saying, well, if it doesn't work, then we should get rid of it. And I have an issue with that approach. And I'm pretty sure a few of you have heard me mention at least briefly on this show a handful of times on how I don't like this approach. So I'm going to do my best to expand on that a bit. Why I don't like utilitarian arguments against government programs or government proposals, why I think they're bad, why I think they're a losing strategy. I'm not sure if I'm going to make the case as clearly as I'd like to, but I'm going to do my best. First of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We broadcast through our channels over at YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, DLive, and Twitch. Those are our live channels. We also have archived video versions at BitChute and Brighteon.com. I know Brighteon is run by a guy named Mike Adams, and he used to host our old school podcast a number of years ago. We used to do a weekly kind of live internet radio show, and Mike is really committed to making sure that you aren't going to get kicked off the platform. So we're definitely regularly uploading to Brighteon. Hopefully they get live streaming sometime in the future as well. So just a heads up on that. Also, we have podcast editions, iTunes, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and elsewhere. I'm very grateful for all the reviews that have been coming in on the iTunes podcast. It really helps spread the word, tells Apple to show the program to more people. You can find all of this stuff, all the places to follow us, the way to subscribe to our newsletter, to support us financially, etc., over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And before getting to my issues with this utilitarian argument, I want to say hi to everyone out in the live chat. Looks like we got a little German. Justin is doing Gut, Danke. Hi to Heather Rossi, EHP Training. I appreciate your email the other day, EHP. David Michael, Tyler B., Austrian Watchman, Andrew Nappy, Justin Morrison, and everyone else. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. And of course, whether it's live or in the archive, please continue to leave some comments. I read all of them, except when I'm a little bit behind schedule, like I have been over the last week. I had some family visiting last weekend, so I've been a little bit behind. I generally read all the comments. I reply to some as I'm able to, and I appreciate all the feedback. So let's get into this. And I'm going to cover... hopefully it'll make sense. I'm not sure. I'm going to do my best. So I've done a bunch of episodes on facial recognition surveillance, and I'm only going to talk about this very briefly. Probably 7 or 8 episodes on facial recognition. If you've heard me talking about this, I often reference in those shows about how there are studies and a lot of organizations talking about how the technology does a bad job. It fails. And it generally does a bad job in identifying people of color. The darker your skin, the more likely it is that the facial recognition surveillance is going to do poorly. You may not be aware of this, but back around 2015 or so, Google's facial recognition algorithm for their Photos app was miscategorizing African Americans as gorillas. It's that bad. It's obviously a lot better than it is now. But if you think about miscategorizing something that badly in a law enforcement setting, I do understand why people push this as one of their arguments. But I think there's a problem when you push the failure or success, supposed success of a government program too far. In fact, I would I would probably make the case that you don't want most government programs to be successful, because most government programs shouldn't exist, whether it's on a federal level, a state, or a local. We don't want these things to work, so we want them to do a bad job and we don't want them to be successful in ripping us off, violating our rights, putting people in cages, and the like. But on facial recognition, there is a stark difference in how the technology works on people of color. It's really, really bad. So just briefly, I want to point out an example of this type of argument. Here from the New York Times last year, there was an MIT study talking about this, and they say facial recognition technology is improving by leaps and bounds. Some commercial software can now tell the gender of a person in a photograph, and it was just released just sometime this month that Amazon's recognition version of this also is getting good at recognizing or nailing your emotional state. They can tell if you're, I think it's either angry or afraid already, almost 99% accurate. So here's how New York Times, or at least the MIT study, to back this up. When the person in the photo is a white man, the software is right 99% of the time. But the darker the skin, the more errors arise, up to nearly 35% for images of darker-skinned women. So what we're seeing in the efforts to pass bans on facial recognition surveillance is people are using this argument. Oh, wow, look, and especially in a society like we have, which is so racially charged. Everything is based on you're good if you're this color, you're bad if you're that color, and it leads to other problems. And at the end of the show, I'm going to point out how, in particular, this type of utilitarian argument against facial recognition is actually going to cause a problem not only right now, but in the long run. So it is factual that it is bad on this. And it is bad that law enforcement was willing to use a tool that does poorly on black people. That makes sense to me. But deeper than that, the problem is that we don't like mass warrantless surveillance in the first place. And here's how the Times summed it up, or at least it looks like the person who was one of the experts quoted for the report. Quote, "You can't have ethical AI that's not inclusive. And whoever's creating the technology is setting the standards." So this gives me the view that as long as everyone has their rights violated equally, they're searched, their person's houses, papers, and effects, their face is searched, and then a digital image of it is seized and kept and stored in a matching file without a warrant based on probable cause, it's okay as long as everyone is equally violated the same. So that is its own problem right there. But it's not just facial recognition, and I'm going to circle back to that near the end. It is also on foreign policy. I recently saw this tweet from the Cato Institute. I follow a lot of organizations on Twitter. And Cato, love them or hate them. I know there's a lot of my friends that can't stand them, a lot of them that really like them, a lot of them that think that they're just, well, whatever. Whether you love or hate Cato is not really the issue here. But what I see from them pretty regularly is a utilitarian argument about everything. And this month, they posted this report, Overcoming Inertia, Why It's Time to End the War in Afghanistan. And the tweet that they posted focused on this particular sentence that I have highlighted here, and I'll read through. "Although the American people are substantially insulated from the sacrifices incurred by this distant war, the reality is that the United States can't win against the Taliban at a remotely acceptable cost." Again, this is the utilitarian argument that it implies, and I tweeted this as well, it implies, I said, I don't like this kind of argument suggesting that the war would be okay if the cost was, quote, acceptable. Well, who determines what's acceptable? So for some people, the people who have confirmation bias, we are more and more as a people only reading and paying attention to sources we already agree with. Some people want to go across the spectrum and look at everything. Not many. Most of us only have time to read, watch, or listen to a certain amount of stuff. So we like to hear the things that validate what we already believe rather than challenge us and push us in other directions. So Cato is making the case that really, the way I read it is, if the cost was acceptable, the cost was lower, whether in lives or money, and they could win at that cost, it's okay. And I think that this is a really dangerous argument. And I know my friends have been posting this, and I saw some copies of my tweet posted on Facebook. And some Cato types were basically saying, look, this is an anti-war piece. They're opposing the war in Afghanistan. And I read through the whole report, and almost the entire thing, they made 10 main points about why you should get out. Almost every single one is a utilitarian argument, whether it's successful or not, whether it's going to cost too much, how people will react to it if they stay. None of it really makes the case that they shouldn't be there in the first place. There is no real reason for them to continue this at all. There's no moral case, there's no legal case, there's no constitutional justification, or if it is, it's pretty much hidden. And I think number 10 really sums this up pretty well. The most compelling, they say, and perhaps only reason to stay in Afghanistan is to avoid a human catastrophe. So they're basically still making the case to stay in Afghanistan after how much money, how many lives, how many years, America's longest war minus the drug war, I guess. And they put it this way: the strongest argument for continuing the forever war in Afghanistan is primarily humanitarian. So they're basically making the case, while supposedly opposing this war, they're making the case for staying, for the opposition. So if you're opposed to the war and still saying, well, staying there is going to be humanitarian, it's helping people, then you really aren't opposing it. And your work, this long paper that they've put together, is going to be ineffective. Or you're just a mole. I don't know. So they say it's primarily humanitarian, as after the fall of the communist regime, the country could descend into another catastrophic civil war. We hear that about every unconstitutional foreign intervention, that once that they're in, it's the sunken cost fallacy. If you leave, it's going to be chaotic. You can't leave Syria. You can't even pull 2,000 troops out of Syria. You can't leave Iraq. You can't leave anywhere, because once the U.S. government is involved in something, it never, ever, ever can leave without a, quote, catastrophe, without people dying in the streets. You can't repeal Obamacare without everyone dying. Suddenly, we're all going to be sick and not able to take care of ourselves or figure out how to deal with things at all. And again, this is the utilitarian argument. And again, I just believe that once you actually take this approach, you're just opening the door. There's no principle. It's just about cost and benefit. And there's always going to be people who are going to take the statistics that you provide and provide a cost benefit that says, you know what, I think $2 trillion is worth it. So I don't think it's important to say whether or not it works. But it's not just the left. It's not just beltway libertarians. It's a lot of gun rights groups. And I think I see that more often than any place, actually, is in the right to keep and bear arms, in opposition to red flag laws, for example, support of concealed carry, opposition to gun control in general. We often hear people, and I've had people ask me, point out how gun control doesn't work. And I don't care whether gun control, quote, works or not. Violating someone's rights is wrong. And the goal isn't to, the goal is liberty. The goal is to advance freedom, to protect people's rights. And that is all that matters. So whether gun control is, quote, effective at stopping criminals or not really doesn't matter. And here's a great example of this. USConcealedCarry.com, which I would think would be a strong ally in the right to keep and bear arms, takes a very strong utilitarian argument in this kind of two-part series. It doesn't totally do this. Like, the whole thing isn't peppered only with utilitarian arguments, primarily like what Cato does in a lot of their work. But here's how they sum it up. There's a reason gun control is controversial. Gun control doesn't work. And they put it this way. I think this really hammers it home. If gun control only stopped criminals and made the world safe, there would be no controversy at all. And I don't know if that is a big red flag to you like it is to me, but they basically have given up. At that statement, they've thrown in the towel on the right to keep and bear arms being a natural right that people should be able to defend themselves, their family, their property, their home, whether or not someone else does something wrong. They've basically said, oh, we just have to figure out how to make it work, and then there's no more controversy. And people will continue pushing for it because of this type of argument. They go on, they say that's not the case. Of course, they're not going to be on the side of more gun control, but their argument against it, I think, empowers the opposition. They say it's not the case. It remains among the most controversial of political policies, and there's a reason. It doesn't work as advertised. And like any, quote, invention, people recognize that something that doesn't, quote, work today will often be improved upon. So like an automobile improving on gas mileage, or a computer being much faster year in and year out, I think the average person probably believes that if they're supporting gun control, they're not supporting small measures today because they think this is going to take away everyone's guns right now, but they see it as a step towards that in the future. So whether or not something works, you should oppose it because it violates people's rights. But this is, they're basically just saying, look, we're on board. We're on board with gun control. Figure out how to get it done. They believe that you could never make the case for that, but what's someone going to do in 5, 10, 50, 100 years when we're long gone? We want to set a strong foundation for the future. We want to think big for humanity, not just in the moment, just short-term thinking on how we can sell people who don't really care in the first place. Because if they don't care in the first place, in 10 years, when they're convinced that it works, they're not going to be on our side. We need to actually win them over on the base principle that our right to keep and bear arms is a natural right, and it needs to exist and needs to be able to be exercised whether or not you can have some kind of end result out of it or not. And of course, it isn't just U.S. concealed carry. I see this all over the place. One guy that you would think would be really on top of this, actually two of them, are Thomas Massie and John Lott. They wrote an article in National Review, surprise, red flag laws are the wrong solution to mass shootings. And the article really talks about all the kind of crazy things that could come up, knocks on doors. They talk about examples in Florida and elsewhere where they have, 1,000 people have been picked up on this in Florida, 1,000 confiscation orders, Maryland's law where there were 300 people had their gun confiscated. And they're talking about percentages. Again, this is a utilitarian argument of whether or not it works. And this was published just on August 12th, this month, just over 2 weeks ago. And this line here that I've got highlighted, if you're watching the video or if you're listening to the podcast, I'll read it shortly, really sums up their entire view. Quote, if you think you are any more likely to stop criminals from getting guns than illegal drugs, you are mistaken. The same drug dealers sell both, and gangs are a major source of guns. Mentally ill individuals can also use weapons such as cars. Actually, that is not the line I wanted to quote. Let me see if I can find this. Here we go. Despite the sacrifices, wow, I jumped to the wrong thing. Despite the sacrifices, they say, the evidence shows no benefits from red flag laws. They've, again, conceded the base principle that the right to keep and bear arms is a natural right. Taking someone's gun without due process is a violation of their rights. The Constitution doesn't allow the federal government to do this type of thing in the first place, and probably most state constitutions, I haven't read all of them. I mean, Illinois is terrible. The Constitution here on the right to keep and bear arms in California isn't all that great either. But they're just saying, look, it just shows no benefit. They've just conceded the argument. They've conceded the base argument, the philosophical argument that our rights are our rights, whether violating them work or not, by saying, look, there's no benefit. Looking at the data they write from 1970 to 2017, these laws had no significant effect on murder, suicide, mass public shooting fatalities, robbery, aggravated assault, or burglary. These laws do not save lives. Not once in this article from Thomas Massie, the supposed leading libertarian in office, and John Lott, one of the top gun rights advocates in the country, neither of them are saying in this article that it's anything other than working. They sum it up by saying stopping future crimes didn't work in the movies and it doesn't work in real life. I don't care whether red flag laws work or not. I don't care whether the war in Afghanistan can be won at a cost that's acceptable or not. I don't care if facial recognition is going to be effective equally effective on white people and black people. I don't care. Violating rights is wrong, whether they have those effects or not. So this is very disappointing to me. And I see actually, at least in my own vision, and maybe I have my own confirmation bias, I see organizations giving up the principle more and more and more. They're primarily focusing on this doesn't work. It won't have the intended effects. There is a point to be made because obviously people hear things in different ways. And I think it is important to still make this kind of case. But what I'm seeing more and more is people are making this as a primary argument. And if that's your only argument, you're going to run into trouble. And I'm going to talk about briefly here in just a moment how we're running into trouble opposing facial recognition surveillance, basing it on racism or on misidentification or bad quality software. But first, there was a really interesting article. I think the guy's name is, how do I say this? I put some notes here. Timothy Shao. He's a professor. And he wrote an article over at FEE that I think is really good. It kind of triggered, between this and the Cato article, it really triggered my thought, pun intended, on how to approach this for a podcast. And the article's titled, "Gun Rights Don't Depend on Statistics." And he's talking about how there's a problem with this utilitarian model, and I absolutely agree. He says, when statistics are invoked in public policy discussions, it is almost always done as part of a cost-benefit analysis. This involves taking a given policy and weighing its positives and negatives. And that's this type of argument. In fact, that's the argument that Thomas Massey and John Lott are making on red flag laws. They're not saying anywhere in here that they shouldn't exist no matter what. Period. And on top of it, for those of you who really believe they work, maybe you'll listen to this. If you don't agree with our principle, if you don't start with that base principle and you start at this other point, you're going to open the door to your opposition. And so Timothy goes on, he says, if there are more positives than negatives, then it's implied that adopting the policy is a good idea. So as soon as you make a case that something can't work, someone else is going to make the same case with the same situation, with the same statistics, and say, well, this is actually an improvement over what we had before. Timothy goes on. He says, if there are more negatives than positives, then it's implied that adopting the policy is a bad idea. Seems simple enough, right? And he goes on talking a little bit about some examples, some kind of life or death examples that probably won't happen. One is a famous one where if there's a surgeon and 5 dying people, can he take a transplant surgeon? Can he kill an innocent person to distribute the organs among the 5? And so that would supposedly yield a net positive result. And wouldn't it be justifiable to do that? And I actually saw this. There was a Netflix sci-fi movie, one of these kind of made-for-TV movies that they had on recently. And this person was kept in isolation in a future time when it was just AI and they were trying to raise a child. The robots were raising a child and they kept showing her examples, kind of life or death situations. And this was basically one of the examples. What's the right choice? So under a utilitarian case, one might say, yes, it is the right choice to just murder this person and steal their organs and give them to other people. Whereas a moral choice might actually come up and say, well, it's wrong to actually kill somebody. I'm not sure. I mean, this is a very tough one, but it certainly is an excellent example. But he's pointing it out to say, quote, so just because something makes sense from a numbers perspective does not mean that it is morally permissible. And he's not making the case one way or the other on what's morally permissible in that situation, but providing in kind of an extreme example how just having the numbers on your side doesn't always provide you clarity. You have to have a moral, philosophical foundation underneath that. And he goes on. He says, where am I going with this? Well, rights trump utility. Rights are what's important. The takeaway, he says, from these examples is that natural rights are not things that depend on the balance of social utility, nor can they be overridden simply because there is a greater good at stake. Now, of course, there's always going to be an argument, and people who are with me on saying that the right to keep and bear arms is a natural right and it should not be infringed no matter what. There isn't a but, there isn't a, okay, well, unless we need to have a red flag law. You're going to agree with me, I think, pretty quickly on that. But, and you're going to agree that those red flag laws don't work either, probably. And I would say that they don't, but I don't care. I don't even spend my time looking at it because the fact of the matter is it doesn't count. Who cares? Who cares? We're actually, if we're making that case, we're basically giving up the principle. And I think that's what Timothy basically is saying here, where he says rights trump utility. The whole article is actually really, really good. It's pretty simple reading. And it's really clear stuff. The link is in the show notes. I'll post that shortly after the live stream is done. He sums it up like this. All that being said, the ultimate foundation for gun rights, and I think this could be applied to any right, the ultimate foundation for rights is not and has never been and cannot ever be statistics. We can use statistics to strengthen our case for our rights, but they cannot be the pillar on which it all rests. As soon as you do that, I think you're screwed. Now, he just wrote an article, and I was kind of looking into this guy. Oh, this is a really interesting post. And his most recent post before this on Fee was talking about statistics. So he's a guy that will use statistics to strengthen the case, and I think there's an appropriate use of that. But when you're basing your entire argument on it, you're always, I think you fought a losing battle. And I did mention that I was going to cover a concrete example of how we're getting screwed over by this approach. And I'm going to go back to facial recognition. For those of you who've watched these episodes, you know that the ACLU recently ran all the state legislators, assembly members, and people in the state Senate, state senators, through Amazon's facial recognition program, and it looked like 26 of them were matched as criminals. I made the joke in that episode that really it got 26 right instead of 26 wrong. But we can see the picture of them all here because all these politicians are clearly criminals. They're awful. But they've basically included this as their main argument. Look, we've made a mistake. They did the same thing last year. This is a 2-year process here in California. They're trying to ban law enforcement from having facial recognition on body cameras because it's going to be used for surveillance. And so the argument against that is not that it is a warrantless mass surveillance tool. They can't just do these searches of people all the time. They actually have to have a warrant based on probable cause. They're not making that case. They're saying that the technology isn't ready for the mainstream. The technology makes errors. The technology misidentifies people of color. It incorrectly now is saying that these legislators are bad. So what has been the result? Just yesterday. So this bill already passed the state assembly pretty easily. The state Senate is actually easier to get positive things through in California, mind you, if we're just ignoring all the garbage that they pass. But if you actually have a good bill on privacy or on certain issues, asset forfeiture, for example, the state Senate generally moves these bills a little bit faster. Law enforcement lobby groups have been aggressively against this. And so for the last 2-3 months, we've heard from basically all the organizations in California, all the privacy groups, ACLU of Southern California, Northern California, EFF, the big groups, the small groups, Fight for the Future. They're making the case that the facial recognition technology makes mistakes. And they're rarely focusing on the issue that a mass warrantless surveillance tool like this is dangerous and shouldn't exist in the first place. They should never use it no matter what, and then pointing out that it makes mistakes. ACLU once in a while will get it right by doing kind of a little bit of both, but they're focusing primarily on the errors. So what they did is they took this bill that was a permanent ban in the assembly that passed by a huge number in the assembly, veto override capable, even though they don't do that too often in state legislatures, especially here in California. And it was probably going to pass the state Senate. But what they did, because they're making this argument that it's not ready for the mainstream, yesterday the state Senate amended it to be a moratorium. So they're going to ban it, but only till 2027. Now, I think it's positive that they would ban it till 2027. So for the next 8 years, they won't be using facial recognition on police body cameras. I think that's positive. But in 8 years, what's going to happen? If the entire argument was based on the fact that it makes a lot of mistakes based on race or on legislative status, I guess, In 8 years, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all those Chinese companies out there, they're going to be way, way better on this. They're not going to be making those mistakes anymore in the next 8 years with the amount of data that's being fed to them in Hong Kong, in San Francisco, in San Diego, and elsewhere in the world, because they're all kind of, the AI learns from all around the world, not just your local area. And in 8 years, they're not going to have these mistakes. It is going to be 99% accurate, or 99.9 or 95 instead of 80% accurate. And what leg are they going to have to stand on when they say, look, now we're not going to renew this ban because what you complained about in the first place, the reason we passed this moratorium back in 2019 is because it got all these things wrong, and now it doesn't anymore. There is zero reason to oppose this. You're actually fighting a losing battle, and you're actually empowering the opposition to do mass warrantless surveillance, to engage in unconstitutional illegal wars, and to do all kinds of gun control, because you're saying that all they have to do is figure out how to make it work. Well, hopefully this makes sense. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure if I'm being clear, but let's take a look over here in the live chat. The Big Cheese, I like your view here. Liberty does not have restrictions, only do no harm. Talking about the NAP, non-aggression principle. Derek Van Brunt, fixing to go after Colorado and the ATF to shut down the gun control argument in the Supreme Court. Thank you for saying. Derek also says you guys do a great job. Justin Bayola, good observation. I think EHP training is correct. Does it pass constitutional muster is what needs to be, is all that needs to be asked. And Mike Meharry ran a really good article on this. We covered it and sent it out as an email maybe 2 months ago. I covered it a little bit in this show. Basically, that's the first question. Does it violate the Constitution? Our goal isn't, are we going to, quote, save lives or not? Our goal isn't going to be, are more people going to have insurance? Can we win this war without spending too much money? These aren't the questions. People are focusing on those questions, and they are empowering the monster state to do more and more, issue by issue by issue, because if you always approach it like that, rather than focusing solely on the Constitution and liberty, then you're going to be in have a big problem. And I think this thing here happening in California with the surveillance is going to play out to be a major problem in the long run. The Big Cheese says positivism, a lawyer's best argument. Heather Rossi, no compromise, absolutely. Derek Van Brunt, why is the Second Amendment the only one with an age restriction? Well, I mean, I've read it as well, probably just like you, Derek. There is absolutely no age restriction on that one. Andrew Nappy says the bill filed in Florida, so probably is this for next year, to enhance red flag law by expanding who can condition for the extreme risk protection order. They aren't happy with how it works. So there's your response to a utilitarian argument. So there was a Florida, I guess famously Republican-controlled, supposed red state, great on the right to keep and bear arms, supposedly. Although we know that they have, I mean, Andrew knows very well, the so-called gun rights organizations that are in power in Florida absolutely hate the idea of nullifying all gun control, especially the feds in Florida. We had so much opposition from the right there in Florida. But then, of course, they cave in and give us this red flag law in Florida. And now, because it's a utilitarian argument, Andrew's making the point that once you make a utilitarian argument, one thing that they pass isn't going to get the job done, because I mean, like Thomas Massey pointed out, these things don't work. So when you make that argument and then they pass them anyways, then they're going to say, well, we got to step in. Now it's not working as we intended. We need to upgrade that law. They rarely repeal things. So once you get it on the books, you're really in trouble. They're definitely going to keep trying to expand it. Take a look. We need common law grand jury, so that's really interesting. The Big Cheese says Judge Knapp's video Reflections on the Loss of Liberty is an excellent video to listen to. If you've got a link to that, Big Cheese, post it in the comments, and I will click on that in the near future to make sure it gets approved. I know YouTube doesn't like links. And even arguing that something is unconstitutional is a losing argument because natural rights trump the Constitution. Well, you could absolutely make both those cases if you focus primarily on your natural right, again, like I'm talking about, the right to keep and bear arms is a natural right, and then add that it is the government doesn't have any authority to do it, And then if you want to add that it doesn't even work, these are all different ways to approach people. For us, it's generally about approaching things from a constitutional basis, and we look to the founders and the way that they set things up. But I think that is a very interesting point as well. So something that I need to think about a little bit further as well. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you found it educational. Hopefully, I've made my point clear. I'm not really sure, but this is a really important one to me personally. I know that a lot of organizations and a lot of activists focus most of their time and energy making these utilitarian arguments. I do almost none of that in my own work. The 10th Amendment Center does almost none of that. Like, not that it's okay even just because you can get some desired result, because that's short-term thinking. It's not thinking about how someone's going to use that power in the future. And whether even if you get the desired result, do you want that in the first place? Is that the right thing? So there's so many issues that I have with making utilitarian arguments. I really try to steer myself and my team, the entire organization, away from that. I hope you'll join me on that. I think there are some times when those utilitarian arguments make sense. I don't know. Everyone's reached in their own way. Anyways, I'm rambling at this point. Thank you again for spending some time with me today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to smash the like, hit subscribe, continue leaving some comments. If you've got ideas for a future show, feel free to email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I do read all your replies, all your emails. I don't get back to every single one, but I do my best. And again, if you want to support us financially for as little as $2 a month, really, really goes a long, long way. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Thanks again for joining me today. Have an awesome Wednesday. I'll be back on Friday morning, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Again, all the archives, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Bye-bye.